Thank you for your messages. A number of people have asked me about the end of the world, what the Orthodox Christian perspective is on the end times, which is what I'm going to make this little talk about. I suppose the first thing we should say is, when thinking about the end of the world, we should avoid sensationalism, we should avoid extremes, avoid things that get us worked up and excited. We need to stay calm, reflective, thoughtful and prayerful. Be sober in our thinking. There is a fashion at the moment, I'm told, in America for these books about those who are left behind after this heresy of the rapture. And the rapture is a heresy. It's a desire to avoid the suffering that is to prefigure the final coming of Christ. But we must remain sober, and yet St. Paul tells us to live with an expectation of the coming of Christ. If we look at the early church, there certainly was an expectation amongst Christian communities that Christ would return in their lifetime. The temple still existed. They could imagine the Antichrist enthroned in the temple until, of course, AD 70, when the temple was destroyed. St. Paul says we are to be watchful, prayerful, live with the expectation of Christ's coming. And we too must do this. We too must live with an expectation of Christ's return. Because every one of us is going to die. Every one of us is mortal, unless Christ returns before we die, of course. And the majority of us, I suspect, will live out our lives and die as many generations have before us. Every one of us, whether Christ returns before our death or not, must stand before God and give an account for our lives. And so the Church Fathers have taught us that the daily remembrance of our own death, the daily remembrance of our mortality, is the only way we can gain a true perspective on our life, is the only way that we can live a true Christian life, to remember our own death, to live in readiness for our death. Saint Seraphim of Sarov each night would sleep in a coffin, which sounds very extreme to some people. But it was a reminder to him that he shouldn't lay down and end any day unless he was absolutely ready to die and stand before God. And this issue of the signs. Many people have asked me about the signs and what to look for before the end of the world. And Jesus, of course, did say we should be watchful. We should look for these signs. First of all, the death of love. We see in the world around us an absence of love. Our own hearts are drying up. Mankind is becoming unloving and egotistical. The individualism of our Western culture particularly is a clear sign that something is going wrong, that evil is running amok. And the preaching of the gospel to the whole world. Certainly there are few places now where orthodoxy has not been preached, and the spreading of the truth of orthodoxy is now reaching almost all the corners of the earth. So we can see this happening, and particularly with modern communications and transport. But this subject of Antichrist comes up again and again in many people's messages and questions. I'm wary of speaking too much about it. I don't want to add to the sensationalism in YouTube and on the internet. But when I was on Mount Athos, a monk was talking to me about this subject, and he started talking about the end times, and he said he believed we were in the final chapter of the book of the world, that the times were indicating a closeness to the end of the world, in his opinion, which I respected, of course. And So I asked him, I said, what about the rebuilding of the temple and the seating of Antichrist as God, enthroned as God in the temple in Jerusalem? Do the fathers on Athos take this literally? And his answer was, many do. He didn't say all, he said many do. For those early Christians, the temple still existed, of course. They could imagine Antichrist seated, enthroned in the temple in the Holy of Holies. The temple is not yet rebuilt. The third temple is yet to come. If we take this literally, then we will see a rebuilding of the temple, and there are many, many powerful and wealthy people contributing to the desire for the building of the third temple. Many Jewish and Christian Zionists, particularly Christian Zionists in America, support this idea of the third temple. If it's built, we should ask ourselves, who will proclaim the Antichrist as God? Well, we perhaps can say, who is it that has rejected the true Messiah? Who is it who is still looking for the Messiah to come? Who is it who is likely to proclaim a false Messiah as Christ? We should look for these things, but we should be careful. We don't know when Christ will return. He told us no one knows. It could be in 10 years, it could be in 100 years. Christ isn't limited to anything. Just as his mercy and love is infinite and boundless, so too he can do anything. He might come in the next hour and confound all our expectations, or he may come in 1,000 years. But our calling is to remain sober and repent, and to seek to live out the spiritual and Christian life that Christ calls us to. This should be our focus, to live in readiness for our own death. And if Christ returns before we die, he will find us ready. He will find us as the virgins who kept their oil lamps burning, who stayed watchful, who kept vigil, who weren't turned away weeping.